Even before the end of World War II, the Allies considered the possibility of a Third World War ensuing. The authors contemplate what the likely course of military actions would have been at the outset of this Third World War and who would have emerged victorious. Summer of 1945. World War II has just ended. In this alternate historical scenario, a Cold War between the Western Allies and the USSR immediately ensues and escalates into full-scale warfare shortly after Japan's defeat. Even before the end of World War II, the Allies had foreseen the possibility of such a war, fearing the Soviets. The creators of the film You're being introduced to went a step further, pondering the capabilities of both sides. What would the possible course of action be at the beginning of this Third World War, and who would emerge victorious? In April, in real time, American forces first met with the Red Army at the Elbe River in Germany, effectively splitting what remained of German territories in half. In May, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. But even in 1945, there were figures like American General George Patton, who believed that the Soviet Union posed as great a threat as Germany had. Patton viewed the Red Army's advance into Germany not as an Allied victory but as Soviet expansion deep into Central Europe. Then there was Operation Unthinkable, first proposed in 1945 by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. This plan examined the possibility of a pre-emptive strike by English and American forces against the Red Army. The strategy proposed a sudden assault by Allied forces consisting of up to 47 British and American divisions around Dresden, aimed at the center of Soviet troop deployment. However, the British Joint Chiefs of Staff deemed this plan unfeasible, believing that the Red Army troops had an overwhelming superiority, with a force ratio of 2.5 to 1. Later, Churchill demanded an additional analysis of the situation, exploring the possibility of a USSR attack on Western Europe after the US withdrawal of its troops to partake in defeating Japan. As stated in the analytical note, in such a case, the Red Army could easily conquer all of Europe, and Britain would only stand its ground thanks to its naval and air forces. All these plans stemmed from a fear of the Soviet Union, which had manifested much earlier. Early in the war, after the Soviet Union and Germany signed the Non-Aggression Pact in 1939, a plan dubbed Operation Pike was devised. Operation Pike was a strategic plan to bomb Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus from air bases in Iran. Advocates of this plan justified the operation by arguing that such an attack could hinder Stalin from supplying Germany with crucial oil and could severely undermine the Soviet economy. In his book Downfall 1945, Stephen Zaloga estimated that the personnel of the Western Allies in Western Europe numbered over 5 million, of which over 3 million were Americans. By the end of the war, just over 1 million people were deployed in Italy. When planning Operation Unthinkable, the British Joint Chiefs of Staff grossly overestimated the number of Soviet troops. A significant portion of any army's personnel consists of support staff, which isn't typically deployed to the front lines. Both the Allies and the USSR had to also consider the Far Eastern Front, where the war with Japan had just concluded. Europe saw a rough parity in troop numbers stationed near the front lines. As mentioned, additional forces were directed to the Pacific Theater, and after Germany's defeat, the USSR directed some of its European forces to advance on Japan. Regarding equipment, the Soviets surpassed the Allies in two types of armaments, tanks and artillery. Nearly all Allied tanks were stationed in Europe, while of the Soviet tanks, just over 5,000 were near Japanese-controlled Manchuria. Data on the number of artillery pieces are less precise due to different classifications by various sources from both sides. In the Allied forces, the US accounted for roughly 2/3 of the total armored vehicles and artillery pieces, and just over half of the aircraft deployed in the European theater. Furthermore, the United States owned the majority of aircraft, given that the US indeed had a significant number of combat aircraft on its territory and in the Pacific, as well as Navy aircraft upon which they could rely. Regarding the Navy, the Allies held a global supremacy in the number of warships, while the Soviet naval presence was symbolic. The Soviets invested their resources in their ground army to combat the Germans during the war, and a sizable ocean-going fleet wasn't a priority for them. It's not hard to imagine a war breaking out between the Western Allies and the Red Army. Initial military skirmishes, whether by accident or mutual distrust, could rapidly escalate into combat and eventually full-blown war. It's entirely possible that these clashes could even be deliberately provoked as a pretext for a full-scale assault against a formal ally. At least initially, the tactical advantage would be on the side of the aggressor, especially if the attack managed to catch the opposition off guard. The first month of this new war would likely be centered around Germany, with each side attempting to drive the other out. The Red Army might try to push the Western Allies back to France across the Rhine. Should they succeed, the Soviet Union might even contemplate advancing through France, pushing the Western Allies back to the Atlantic coast. On the other hand, with a swift and decisive offensive by the Allies, possibly even under the leadership of General Patton, the Western Allies could drive the Red Army out of Germany and potentially even Poland. The Allied forces in Italy should not be overlooked. The Alps, along with Switzerland's neutrality, could be obstacles in their path, and if caught off guard, it might be more challenging for them to get to the primary theater of operations in Germany. The Western Allies might attempt to regroup in northern Italy. From there, they could try to move their troops by land and sea to France to join the main Allied forces. Alternatively, the Allies might also attempt a counteroffensive through Austria, targeting the southern flank of the main Soviet forces. In 1945, Austria was divided by its liberators and occupied. It's likely it could have been used as a battlefield without its consent. Given the troop and equipment reallocations for Operation Unthinkable, and the actual troop numbers by the summer of 1945, the Allies could rely on about 80 infantry and 23 armored divisions in Europe. In contrast, the Soviets could deploy 230 infantry and 36 armored divisions in Europe. Of course, the military units of both sides aren't directly comparable. In nominal terms, the divisions of the Allies typically had about 50% more troops than stated, and in reality, both sides had fewer troops on the battlefield. In fact, the personnel strength of a Soviet division was sometimes half of its official number. The strength of the personnel composition assumed the inclusion of various Allied troops, such as the French, Polish, or Romanian, but potential German troops were not accounted for. For every frontline soldier of the Western Allies, there were more support personnel, so the Soviets' numerical superiority was slight. However, the actual number of Soviet frontline troops could be about 1.5 to 2 times more than that of the Western Allies. It's hard to imagine that this war would conclude by the winter of 1945. With such a large number of troops and such a small territory, the frontlines would not shift quickly. We have historical precedents, like the Operation Bagration initiated just a year earlier, during which the Soviet Union made significant advances towards Germany in 1944. The Soviets already had a considerable advantage in equipment, experience, and manpower then. It took them nearly 2 months to advance 100 to 200 miles and another 9 months, fighting against the weakened Germans and as the front narrowed, to reach Berlin and effectively enter the city. The Western Allies were no faster. It took them 1.5 months, once they began their push into Germany across the Rhine, to move the front by an average of 200 miles. And they had a better ratio of manpower against the Germans. Covering almost 200 miles in a month is virtually impossible, a distance the Soviets would need to drive the Allies back to Paris or for the Allies to push the Soviets to Warsaw. Large defensive forces simply need time to prepare. Even if the Soviet Union somehow achieved military victories throughout 1945 and pushed the Western Allies back to the sea, the Allies still had naval superiority and secure airbases in the UK, Norway, Italy, and southern France. The odds of the Soviet Union's final victory would diminish as the Red Army approached the Atlantic and the North Sea. On the other hand, even if the Western Allies somehow managed to push the Red Army out of Poland, they would still face a prolonged war or even confront the daunting prospect of invading the Soviet Union. And we all know what happened when Germany attempted that. It's not difficult to imagine that long supply routes when advancing deep into a country, while the defending side has shorter supply routes, could significantly influence the course of a battle, or at least the pace of the advance. In theory, a rapid advance could benefit from increased support per Allied soldier, but due to the evident concentration of troops in such a relatively small area, this would likely be unachievable. Furthermore, for the same reason, any numerical advantage in armored units would be negated, or rapid breakthroughs through the enemy's front lines might not come to fruition. In these conditions of force concentration on a small territory, there simply wouldn't be a weak point in the front line for one side to break through and encircle the enemy. Thus, the Red Army wouldn't genuinely benefit from its numerical superiority in armored units. The Allies' aerial numerical advantage would also pose a threat to Soviet tanks and artillery, and would partially offset the fewer artillery pieces the Allies would employ. However, the most significant successes the Western Allies might achieve, due to their air superiority, would be in destroying Soviet supply routes just behind the front lines. This would make it even harder for the Soviet troops to repel enemy attacks. To bolster their forces, the Western Allies might even attempt to recruit their former enemies to their side. After all, Germany's leadership saw the Soviet Union as its primary threat. Even at the war's end, some in Germany hoped that the USA and the UK might join forces with Germany to strike against the Soviets. But deploying German troops would be risky, as not all would be ready to fight side by side with their former adversaries. Considering plans for Operation Unthinkable, the Allies at that time genuinely expected to handle at least 2 German divisions or, at best, roughly 700,000 German soldiers and make them fight on their side. Subsequently, both sides would have to consider the theater of operations in the Pacific. The USA would retain some of its approximately 20 divisions around Japan and, using the other divisions, might attempt to tie up Soviet forces in the Far East. But in reality, an attack on Vladivostok would be improbable. The Soviets would merely mobilize their resources at even the slightest attempt to make a naval invasion of Japan. Perhaps the Sakhalin Island and the southern tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula would ultimately be ceded to the USA, should they wish to endure more substantial losses. It would still not have influenced the main theater of military operations in Europe. What would transpire in 1946 and the subsequent years would likely be dictated not by armies or commanders, but by industrial production capacity and the stability of supply routes. The vast territory of Eastern Europe was both a boon and a bane for the Red Army. At the start of the war, the Soviet Union successfully evacuated entire factories beyond the Ural Mountains. However, supplying Soviet troops remained a challenge. Railroads were a vulnerable weak point, given that there were relatively few in the Soviet Union and Poland. Successfully bombing these railroads would greatly impede the Red Army supplies. The USSR might attempt to restore factories in specific Central European territories, but first, they would need to rebuild the shattered infrastructure and pacify a hostile population, all while battling the Western Allies. During World War II, the Western Allies supplied the Soviet Union with military aid through the Lend-Lease program. By the time Germany was defeated, most of this aid had already been delivered, so curtailing the program in the summer of 1945 wouldn't have greatly benefited the Allies. In some ways, the Allies complicated their fight against the Soviets due to all this Lend-Lease aid. In terms of supplies and production, the Western Allies would be in a much better position. They controlled the sea routes and could easily transport troops, ammunition, materials, and food across the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea. The Soviet Navy would largely be locked in. The Allied naval forces might even be reduced, with some of their resources redirected to bolster the Air Force and Army, if the war lasted long enough for such changes to be justified. All of Great Britain would serve as a gigantic launchpad for an invasion into the European continent. As for the civilians of Eastern and possibly Central Europe, they would likely have preferred occupation by the Western Allies over Stalin's Red Army. Owing to these two factors, the Western Allies would hold an advantage in this war, and it's even possible that the balance of power could shift in their favor. And we haven't even considered the use of nuclear weapons yet. By the summer of 1945, the USA successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. 2 were ready for use, with a third being assembled. By November 1945, up to 12 more bombs would be ready for production. It's highly probable that a war against the Soviets would prompt their continued production, and by early 1946, another 10 atomic bombs might be ready. It would be sensible for the Western Allies to deploy this limited stockpile of a new superweapon against the USSR. Back then, it was just another bomb, albeit a powerful one. Indeed, some plans within Operation Unthinkable involved dropping about 20 American bombs on various targets within the USSR. It's plausible that the Western Allies would aim to cripple the Soviet war-driven economy by dropping nuclear bombs on vital oil industry cities in the Caucasus region, like Baku. They might even target major cities, such as Moscow. Though achieving this would be considerably more challenging due to the distance and dense defenses. But penetrating deep into Soviet territory would mean significant casualties, as there wouldn't be enough escort fighters. Turkey would have been an interesting foothold for the war. Historically, it was somewhat closer to the Allies at that time, but it's uncertain how neutral it would have remained. There could have been attempts to strike Soviet troops near the battlefield with nuclear weapons, but it might not have been worth it, unless it was to undermine the enemy's morale. A 20-kiloton atomic bomb, similar to the one dropped on Nagasaki, could kill a person out in the open within about 2 kilometers of the explosion's epicenter. However, many soldiers would likely find some form of shelter, and troops in various vehicles would probably be safe even within a kilometer. Those in tanks would be safe from even closer ranges. Considering the number of Soviet divisions, and the front's breadth and depth, a single bomb could neutralize about half or an entire division. Delivering such strikes with this outcome every few weeks would significantly harm the Soviet Union, but it wouldn't cripple the country's power. Technologically, the USSR generally lagged behind the Western Allies. Although the Soviet Union had experimented with radar before the war, the Red Army became genuinely interested in radar technology only after Germany attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. By the end of World War II, the first American and British jet fighters were just being introduced. It took the Soviet Union another 3 years to commission its first jet fighters. The first Soviet atomic bomb, which closely resembled the American plutonium bomb Fat Man, was tested in 1949. Soviet scientists combined their expertise with information gathered by spies, and reconstructed technology captured in Germany, the UK, and the US, bridging the technological gap by the late 1940s. While a new war with the Western Allies would have provided added impetus for the introduction and development of new weaponry, it would have also placed an additional strain on the Soviet industry and economy. So, its production after World War II was massive. Yet, it still lagged behind the production in Allied countries. If both sides had to sustain the scales of such total wartime production, the Allies would seemingly have an easier time maintaining those scales. Here's just one example with data on the number of tanks and planes produced from 1943 to 1945, illustrating the essence of their production potential. One should consider the absence of production strain on the Allies from the Lend-Lease program, as well as the reallocation of resources now, given that the Allies no longer needed to maintain such a large fleet. But even with the presence of nuclear weapons, a war between the US and the USSR would have been long and bloody. How long? The Western Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, but even when Germany had to fight against the most potent armies of that time on 2 fronts simultaneously, it took the Allies almost a full year to defeat it. A similar war between the Western Allies and the USSR, both possessing very strong armies, would span a single front across the continent. If the Red Army managed a surprise offensive, they could catch the Allies off guard and push them closer to the Atlantic. But they wouldn't be able to hold them there. The Western Allies would, in the end, probably force the Soviet troops back to eastern Poland. However, an assault on the Soviet Union itself would be disastrous, both in terms of human casualties and in the sense that the economy would teeter on the brink of total collapse. It's likely that if the US and the UK attempted an offensive on Moscow, their losses would be several times greater than those during World War II. Facing such losses post-World War II, the Western alliance might even politically disintegrate. Both sides would be too strong to be defeated and too weak to deliver a swift, crushing blow. This new war would further devastate what little remained of European infrastructure after 6 years of warfare, resulting in massive new waves of refugees. In the end, the Western Allies would most likely prevail due to their superiority in nuclear potential, manpower, and economy. Over 4 years of war with the Germans, the Soviet Union lost up to 10 million soldiers and an additional 10 to 16 million civilians. Consequently, its industry and infrastructure faced repeated devastation, initially destroyed by the Red Army during its retreat in 1941, and later by the Germans when they were driven out of the Soviet Union by the Red Army. It's crucial to remember that the Western Allies possessed a powerful and robust industrial base. The territory of the USA remained largely untouched by enemy attacks. Thanks to the British colonies, the Western Allies had access to resources from around the world. With the American and British navies, the Western Allies controlled seas and oceans globally. For these reasons, along with the presence of nuclear weapons, the Red Army would likely, in the end, leave Central Europe or be pushed out by Western armies, retreating to its borders and reaching some armistice agreement. In any case, both sides would find themselves in this stalemate after a long and bloody war. And remember, while we can speculate endlessly about hypothetical wars, only genuine peace can truly unite us all.